My name is Claire Sutton. I am 34 years old. I am an immigration attorney in Houston, Texas. And on a Wednesday morning in February, while I was reviewing a motion to reopen for a client whose case had been sitting in administrative limbo for 2 years, my assistant knocked on my office door and set a certified envelope on my desk without saying a word. She did not say a word because the name on the return address label was a name she had never heard me use. Nobody in that office had. It was not my name. It had not been my name for 16 years, but it was the name someone in Alamo Heights, San Antonio, had written on the outside of an envelope addressed to my professional office. My work address, the address printed on my business cards and my firm's website, the address I had given to no one from my former life. I signed for the envelope. I set it to the right of my keyboard. I stared at the name written on it for a while in the particular way you stare at something that should not exist. Then I picked up my coffee mug, took a sip, and realized my coffee was cold because I had not touched it since I sat down at 7:30 that morning. I knew, before I opened the envelope, what kind of information would be inside. Not the specifics, but the architecture of the thing, the shape of it. Some knowledge is older than your conscious mind. Some recognition arrives in your hands before it reaches your eyes. Let me tell you how I became someone who could recognize that shape. Let me tell you what was inside the envelope. And let me tell you what I did with it. Because what I did with it is the reason I am sitting here telling you this story at all. I grew up in a neighborhood in the northwest part of Houston called Garden Oaks, in a house with a blue front door and a fig tree in the backyard that my father had planted the year my parents bought the house, and considered a personal point of pride for reasons that escaped me as a child, but that I understand now as the behavior of someone constructing a permanent image. The fig tree was healthy and ornamental, and produced fruit nobody in the family particularly liked to eat. It looked, from the street, exactly like the kind of tree a successful, rooted, productive family would have in their yard. My father, Eduardo Calderon, was an immigration consultant with a licensed practice that specialized in serving the Salvadoran community of Houston's Northwest Quadrant, which was large and established and deeply interconnected in the way tight immigrant communities become when they rely on each other's networks for housing, employment, legal navigation, and the particular kind of emotional sustenance that comes from being surrounded by people who understand what you left behind and what you carried with you. My father had arrived in the United States at 22 with a work visa and a willingness to adapt that he later described as the defining quality of his early success. He was naturalized at 31, licensed as a consultant at 34, and by the time I was born, he was a man whose name people in the community invoked the way they invoke the name of a pastor or a doctor, as someone you called when the situation was serious and you needed someone you could trust completely. My mother, Carmen, ran the Esperanza Community Center for blocks from our house. She organized the Quincera Committee, the ESL evening classes, the food bank coordination during hurricane season, and the annual gala that raised money for legal aid services for low-income immigrants. She was the woman other women called when they needed help. And she was the woman those women sent their daughters to help with the decorating, the accounting, the logistical infrastructure of celebration and crisis that made community life function. She had a specific quality I have spent years trying to name precisely. She was warm in a transactional way. She made everyone she helped feel genuinely cared for, and she was genuinely good at the act of caring. But underneath it, there was always an awareness of what the act of caring was building for her, for my father, for us, for the image the family projected into the community that trusted us with everything. I want to be careful here, because I spent years confused about the difference between performance and sincerity. And I have worked in immigration law long enough to know that the two can coexist in a person and that their coexistence does not simplify anything. My parents were not faking their warmth entirely. The warmth was real. It was simply also strategic. They knew, in the specific way that people who depend on community trust know, that the warmth was their most valuable professional asset. And that asset required maintenance. I was their maintenance crew. My brother Mateo, 3 years younger than me, was 2. We were the children who appeared at community events in neat clothing and answered respectfully when adults spoke to us, and represented, by our visible health and happiness, proof of concept. You could trust Eduardo Calderon with your family's future because look at his family. Look at those children. Look at that blue front door. I did not understand what I was doing when I was doing it. I thought I was just being part of the family. Most children do. The costume fits so well when you've been wearing it your whole life that you stop noticing it's a costume. The thing my parents had not told me, by the time I was 12 years old, was that I did not have a green card. I want to say that sentence clearly, because it took me years to say it without feeling the particular shame that belongs to a child who was lied to and who blames themselves for the shape of the lie. I did not have a green card. I had been brought to the United States from El Salvador as an infant, before my father's naturalization, at a time when the family's status was in transition. My father had the knowledge, the connections, and the resources to have filed the appropriate petition for my adjustment of status years before I was old enough to understand what that meant. He had done so for Mateo, who was born in Houston and was a citizen by birthright. He had done so for himself. He had not done so for me. The reason he had not done so was not complexity. It was not cost. It was not the backlog of a particular immigration court. It was not any of the things he told me, when I was old enough to ask directly, that it was. The reason my father had not filed my adjustment petition was that my undocumented status was the most efficient tool of control he had ever discovered, and he was not ready to give it up. When I was 12, I could not have articulated this. I could only feel it. I could feel it in the way certain doors had edges I was not allowed to approach. I could not go to the Galveston Beach birthday party my friend Isabel invited me to because, my mother said, the ferry required identification and we did not want to attract attention. I could not join the Girl Scouts because the registration form required a social security number, and my parents said we would figure that out later. I could not apply for the summer theater program at the Community Arts Center because the forms required documents we would have to discuss with the lawyers first. Everything was either not yet or not now, or not while things were still being sorted out. And the sorting out never concluded, and the not yet never arrived. And I learned to stop looking at the door and start pretending there was no door. What my parents taught me to call protection was the thing I would later learn to call a cage. I was 14 when a classmate named Rosario asked me, on the bus home from school, why I never went anywhere. We had been in the same class for 2 years by that point, and had developed the kind of easy friendship that grows in proximity without requiring much cultivation. She was not unkind in asking. She was genuinely puzzled. She had been to the beach and to the summer program and to the scout meetings, and I had been absent from all of them for 2 years with reasons that sounded increasingly thin. I said my family was busy. I said my parents worked a lot. I said there were things being sorted out, using the language I had been given. Rosario looked at me for a moment with the particular look that comes from someone who has decided to say the honest thing. She said her cousin had been undocumented and she knew what not yet, and were working on it meant. She said it without cruelty and without pity. She said it the way you say a true thing to someone who already knows it and is waiting for permission to say it themselves. I did not answer her on the bus, but something cracked open that afternoon. The way things do when someone names the shape of a thing you have been carefully not naming. That night, asked my father, for the first time clearly and directly, why my papers were still not resolved. I was 14, and I used the words my papers, because I understood by then what I was asking, even if I had never said it plainly. He sat back in his chair and folded his hands and told me that immigration was complicated, that the system had backlogs, that people waited for years, that he was doing everything he could, and that I needed to trust him. I looked at him while he said this. I had grown up in an immigration consulting office. I had heard my father use the word backlog in his professional context many times. I knew what the word meant, when it was true, and what it meant when it was a shelf. Someone was storing something on until they were ready to deal with it. I went to bed that night with the specific coldness of a child who has realized something about a parent that they cannot unrealize. The following year, when I was 15, my AP history class was selected for a spring trip to Washington, D.C. I want to tell you what that trip meant to me before I tell you what happened, because I think the meaning matters for understanding what came next. Amar Adalik had been my history teacher for 1 year by that point. He was a Nigerian-American man in his late 40s with a precise intelligence and the particular gift of making the structure of events feel like something you could understand rather than just memorize. He had noticed something about the way I wrote. He had noted it in my papers, commented on it in class. and at the beginning of spring semester had told me that he was assigning me to give the Library of Congress presentation during the DC trip because he thought I would do something interesting with it. This was the first time a teacher had trusted me with something they thought I would do something interesting with. I had been working on the presentation for 6 weeks by the time the permission slip came home. The permission slip had a section at the bottom for documentation. Not a passport, necessarily. A state-issued ID card would work. A school ID would not. The hotel check-in and the Capitol building entrance both required government-issued identification for all participants over 13. It was a single line, 4 words, at the bottom of the form. Government-issued ID required. I stared at that line for 3 days before I filled in the rest of the form and wrote. In the documentation section, the words "I do not have one." I folded the form and put it in my backpack and did not take it out until Mr. Adelic collected them in class. He read through the stack of forms that afternoon, and the next morning, before the first bell, he asked me to come to his classroom. He closed the door. He sat at his desk rather than standing over me, which I noticed because adults who want to manage you usually stand. He looked at me for a moment and said he had read what I had written on the form. He asked carefully whether I wanted to tell him anything about it. I said no immediately. The way you say no to the first version of a question when you are not sure yet if you trust the person asking. He said that was fine. He said he wanted me to know that there were people who helped with situations involving documentation and that those people were different from immigration enforcement and different from my parents, if that mattered. He said he wasn't going to contact anyone without my permission. He said the form was still on his desk, and he hadn't submitted anything yet, and that if I wanted to talk to him before he did. His door was open before school every day. Then he asked me to go to my first class. And I did, and I sat in that class for 47 minutes without hearing a single word the teacher said. I came back. The next morning before school, I sat down in the chair across from his desk, and I told him that my father was a licensed immigration consultant who had not filed my adjustment petition, and that I had been without documentation for my entire life in the United States, and that I thought it was on purpose, but I could not prove it. I said it all in one long sentence. The way you say something when you are afraid that if you pause you will lose your nerve. Mr. Adelic did not interrupt. He did not express alarm. He wrote something on a notepad, tore off the page, and slid it across the desk. It had a name and a phone number on it. He said the name was Elena Vargas and that Elena worked for a nonprofit that handled exactly these situations and that the call was mine to make, not his, and that nobody would contact my parents unless I chose that. I put the piece of paper in the inside pocket of my backpack, next to my presentation notes about the Library of Congress. I made the call that afternoon from a payphone outside the drugstore to blocks from our house, using quarters I borrowed from Rosario, who asked no questions about what I needed them for. Elena Vargas was in her 30s, with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from years of working in systems that move slowly while people's lives do not. She met me at a library near school 3 days after I called. She reviewed my situation in a single session with the thoroughness of someone who had seen this pattern before. She told me that my case for adjustment of status was not complicated by the delay. The grounds were solid. The petition was straightforward. She told me she could not understand, from a professional standpoint, why my father had not filed it years ago. The cost was manageable for someone in his position. The process was one he could complete in his sleep. The delay was not bureaucratic. It was a choice. She said this last part gently, not as an accusation, but as a clarification. And I sat with it in the library chair for a moment while people walked past with their books and their ordinary afternoons, and I understood something I had been circling for 3 years without being able to land on it. The paperwork was my father's instrument. My status was his leverage. My dependence on him to eventually resolve it was the mechanism by which he kept me from asking certain questions and going certain places and becoming certain kinds of independent. It was not protection. It had never been protection, Elena said. Her organization was required by protocol to notify my parents that a petition was being initiated on my behalf. She explained this clearly, and she apologized for the constraint, and she said she would be present for anything that followed. She had made calls like this before. She knew what was likely to happen. What happened was that my father called her within 2 hours and told her, in the language of a professional who knew exactly which words to use, that his daughter was a troubled teenager with a history of distorted thinking, and that this inquiry was a symptom of a family problem that the family was handling privately. He was calm. He was fluent. He was the same man who reassured Mrs. Delgado and 100 families like her. That night, my father came to my room. He did not yell. He sat at my desk chair while I sat on my bed, and he spoke to me in a low voice about loyalty and about what happened to families when they let outsiders interfere in private matters. He said, if I continued with the petition, he would provide a formal statement to the relevant authorities indicating that I had a documented history of delusional ideation and that the nonprofit had been manipulated by a confused minor. He said he had the relationships in this community to make that statement credible. He said he loved me, and he did not want to do this, but that he would do what he needed to do to protect the family. I said I was going forward anyway. What I did not tell him was that I had already given Elena the name of 2 families my father had consulted with, families I had overheard in the waiting room of his office, families whose paperwork had stalled in ways that did not match the timelines my father had described to them. I had been listening to those waiting room conversations for 3 years. I knew more about my father's practice than anyone in that house had understood. The week that followed was the longest of my life. Elena filed an emergency protective motion, citing the coercive nature of my home environment given my documentation status and my father's professional control over it. The family court system moved faster than I expected, which Elena told me later was because the documentation angle made the situation unusual enough to draw immediate attention. A social worker named Patricia Obumseli came to our house 3 days after the motion was filed. She was a compact woman with a silver streak in her hair and the unhurried demeanor of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had made her peace with its pace. My mother sat on the sofa and cried. My father sat in the armchair with his arms crossed and explained, in precise and reasonable language, that his daughter had been manipulated by outside parties who did not understand the complexity of the family's situation. Patricia Obumseli listened to all of this. Then she asked to speak with me alone. In my bedroom, with the door closed, she asked me to tell her about my documentation situation in my own words. I did. She asked me whether my father had ever explicitly connected my undocumented status to my behavior in the household. I said yes, and I told her when, and I told her what he had said the night after Elena filed the petition. She wrote it all down. She asked me who else I had told. I said Mr. Adelic and Elena Vargas and my friend Rosario. She asked whether I had any evidence beyond my own account. I said yes. I opened my desk drawer and took out a folder I had been keeping for 6 weeks since my conversation with Rosario on the bus. Inside were printed copies of 2 client communication emails I had found in my father's home office printer tray, which he had not noticed because he regularly used me to sort and file his correspondence. The emails were between my father and clients whose petition timelines did not match what the emails described as the actual filing dates. I had not understood exactly what I was seeing when I started collecting them. I understood now. Patricia Obumseli looked at those printed pages for a long time. Then she closed the folder and set it on my desk between us and said that she was going to need to make some additional calls and that she wanted me to come with her. I asked where. She said somewhere safe. Tonight, while the situation was being assessed, I looked around my room. The desk with the worn-out chair, the shelf of textbooks, the notebook where I kept my presentation notes. I took the notebook in the folder and I followed her out. Temporary placement was with my Aunt Rosa, my father's older sister, who lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Clear Lake area of Houston, with a cat named Cello and a cabinet full of herbal teas. She pressed on anyone who came through. Her door in distress. Rosa had left the family for years before. She and my father had a falling out that nobody in the family discussed except to describe it as a misunderstanding about money, which is almost always what families call financial betrayal when they would rather not use that word. She had not spoken to Eduardo since then. She had known about me only through the second-hand accounts of family members who had tried to keep the peace. When the social worker called her, she said she would be in the agency's parking lot in 40 minutes. She was in the parking lot in 37. Rosa was not a soft woman. She was sharp and direct, and she cried exactly once. The first night, I stayed with her, quietly in the kitchen while she thought I was asleep, and never again in front of me. She made eggs in the morning. She kept the television on at a low volume because, she said, silence in the evenings made her think too much. She had no children, and had never wanted any, and made no pretense of suddenly becoming motherly. She treated me instead like someone who was temporarily sharing her space, and who deserved to be treated like a competent person rather than a problem being managed. It was exactly what I needed and nothing I had expected. The investigation that followed. The emergency placement was not fast. Investigations with multiple overlapping jurisdictions rarely are. The Texas Department of Family and Protective Services handled the child welfare component. Elena Vargas's organization filed a formal complaint with the Texas Office of Consumer Credit Commissioner and separately with the Texas Secretary of State regarding my father's consulting license. A third complaint was filed with the Federal Department of Justice Office of Inspector General. Each of these processes moved at its own pace. What they found, collectively, was not a simple story. My father's files contained evidence of a pattern that had been running for at least 7 years. Consultation fees charged for services that had never been rendered. Filing fees collected from clients whose petitions had been submitted incorrectly, sometimes deliberately so, creating grounds for rejection that would require additional consultation to navigate. Retainer amounts that bore no relationship to the complexity of the actual cases. Clients who had waited 3, 4, 5 years for status resolution that the timelines in the files indicated should have taken 18 months at most. 41 families identified in the initial review. 63 by the time the federal component concluded its investigation. I want to stop here and be precise about something that matters. 63 families. Most of them had arrived in the United States with everything they had saved and everything they hoped for. They had handed those savings to a man who sat across from them in an office with certificates on the wall and a photograph of a commissioner and 2 well-dressed children in a frame on his desk. And they had trusted him because every signal available to them said that trust was warranted. The money was not just money. For an undocumented family, a failed petition is not just a financial loss. It is years of limbo extended. It is children who age out of protection. It is a person who had been planning to bring their mother over, not being able to do it before she died. The harm ran deeper than any dollar amount. My father knew this. He had been an immigration consultant for over a decade. He understood better than almost anyone what his failures were costing his clients beyond the fees. He had that knowledge, and he had made his choices. Anyway, and I cannot tell you even now, 16 years later, whether that makes what he did better or worse than simple ignorance would have made it. I think it makes it worse. But I have learned in my career that understanding why something is terrible and knowing what to do with that understanding are 2 different skills. The licensing proceedings moved faster than the criminal case. My father's consulting license was suspended within 4 months of the initial complaints. The suspension was followed by a formal revocation hearing, in which I was not required to testify because the documentary evidence was sufficient, which was one of the few gifts that process gave me. By the time the criminal referral reached the federal level, I had been placed with Rosa for 8 months and had started my sophomore year at a new school, where I was enrolled under my middle name, which Rosa's attorney had advised as a practical measure while the case was pending. My father was indicted on federal charges of immigration fraud, false statements to federal agencies, and wire fraud. He was convicted on 7 of 9 counts. He was sentenced to 4 years and served 2 years and 11 months before being released. My mother was charged separately. She had managed the client billing and the account reconciliation for the practice for the entirety of the period in question. She accepted a plea agreement, 3 years of probation, a fine, and a permanent prohibition from employment in any federally regulated financial services or immigration consulting capacity. She did not contest the terms. The community response was not uniform, and I want to be honest about that, because the narrative of sudden communal rejection is too simple. There were people who defended my parents for months, who wrote character letters, who spoke at the initial hearings, who believed the version my father had prepared, a troubled teenager, outside manipulation, a family trying to heal privately. Some of those people had never been his clients and had no financial stake in the truth. They had only the image, which had been carefully constructed over years to be exactly the kind of image that inspires loyalty. But there were other people. People who had waited 3 years for status that should have taken 1. People who had never understood why their paperwork kept being rejected. People who had paid fees they could not afford for services they had not received. Those people started calling Elena Vargas's organization within weeks of the first news coverage. They had their own stories. They had their own folders of documents they had not understood, but had kept. 63 families became 81 by the time the case closed. The community center, my mother, had run for 12 years, shut down 6 months. After her conviction, because the city grant that funded, it was rescinded following an audit that found irregularities in grant fund management, dating back for years. My father's fig tree died the winter after the house was sold to pay restitution. I know this because Rosa told me, because a neighbor had told her. I have not been back to Garden Oaks, and I do not plan to go. But I keep that detail somewhere in my memory. A tree that was planted as an image, that never produced anything anyone actually wanted, that finally stopped performing when the performance was no longer required. There is something in that detail that feels approximately accurate. I want to tell you about Rosa, because she deserves to be in this story in full. Rosa Calderon was 51 years old when I came to live with her. She worked in supply chain logistics for a medical device company and had the organized, pragmatic intelligence of someone who has spent her career ensuring that complicated systems function without drama. She applied the same approach to having a traumatized teenager in her apartment. She made a list of practical things that needed to happen: school enrollment, therapy, referral, documentation, petition filing, legal name adjustment, long-term placement paperwork. She worked through the list methodically. When something on the list required an emotional decision, she stated the options, offered her opinion once if I asked for it, and then stepped back. She told me once, when I asked her why she had left the family, that she had loaned Eduardo money during a difficult period in his first years of the practice, and had discovered later that he had borrowed the same amount from 3 different family members simultaneously, using each loan as proof to the others that the financial situation was under control. She said she had not been able to stay in a relationship with someone who operated that way. She said she had loved him in the way you love someone you grew up with, and that the love and the decision to leave were not incompatible, which was a thing I needed to hear at 15 and did not know I needed to hear. She never became my mother. She never tried to. What she became was the first adult I had lived with who treated my perceptions as reliable data. If I said something felt wrong, she engaged with the wrongness rather than interrogating my reasons for feeling it. If I said I did not want to talk about something, she changed the subject without making the refusal into an event. She was the person who drove me to every hearing, every therapy appointment, and every meeting with Elena Vargas for 2.5 years. She did not make it sentimental. She made it logistical, which was exactly right. The adoption was eventually formalized, legally, when I was 17. Rosa had not initiated the conversation. I had, because by then I had been living with her for 2 years, and she had quietly become the person I thought of when I thought of the word family. And I wanted the paperwork to say what was true. She said yes immediately, without deliberating. In the way you say yes to something you have already decided long before the question was asked. When the court finalized the adoption, she took me to a restaurant she had been saving for a special occasion. She ordered the expensive thing on the menu. She told me I could order whatever I wanted. Then she said that I should probably decide what I wanted to do about my name. She said it practically, the way you discuss a logistical decision. She said she was not attached to any particular outcome. I said I wanted to keep Calderon out of it. I thought about my father's name on his certificate, on the community center placard on the frame beside his desk, on the envelope of every letter I had ever watched him mail to a client who trusted him completely. I wanted a name that had not been used as a credential for someone else's deception. She said that was reasonable. I became Claire Sutton. Claire, from a book I had read during the months I spent in Rosa's apartment, whose protagonist was a woman who built things with her hands in conditions that should have made building impossible. Sutton because it was Rosa's mother's maiden name. And Rosa's mother had been a woman who had crossed 2 borders and raised 4 children, and never once, by anyone's account, used a single person's trust as an instrument. That night in the restaurant, Rosa ordered dessert. We sat there for another hour talking about nothing important. It is one of the most specific memories I carry from that time. Not a dramatic moment, not a declaration, just 2 people at a table, eating something sweet. with nothing required of either of them. I finished high school with a 4.1 GPA and 2 letters of recommendation, one from Mr. Adalik and one from Elena Vargas, that together told the story of what I had done in a way that made college application reviewers pay attention. I went to the University of Houston on a scholarship that Elena's organization had been instrumental in identifying. I majored in political science and legal studies, and worked 20 hours a week in the financial aid office, and went to therapy every Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock, and slowly learned to trust the stability of a schedule that did not depend on anyone else's mood. Law school was University of Texas. I chose immigration law in the first semester of my second year, not because I had spent my whole life planning it, but because I took an immigration law clinic in October and discovered that the work felt like something I had always known how to do without knowing I knew it. Reading a client's file and identifying where the process had gone wrong. Understanding the gap between what a client had been told and what the documentation actually showed. Spotting the places where legitimate complexity had been used to obscure deliberate harm. These were skills I had developed, without intending to, in the years of living inside a system that had been designed to confuse me about my own situation. I passed the Texas bar on my first attempt. I worked for 3 years at a nonprofit immigration legal services organization, which is where I built the foundational knowledge and the case volume that made the next thing possible. Then I opened my own firm, which I named Claridad, because clarity is the specific thing I had been denied for the first 15 years of my life, and the thing I have tried since then to provide to everyone who comes through my door. Claridad specializes in 2 areas. The first is humanitarian protection, asylum, withholding, and related relief for clients fleeing persecution. The second is what I call status restoration, cases where a client's immigration status has been damaged or stalled by negligent or fraudulent legal representation. Cases where someone trusted the wrong person with their most important documents and their most important years. I am, according to the Texas State Bar's unofficial typology, a malpractice attorney. My clients tend to think of me more simply. They call me the lawyer you go to when the other lawyer ruined your life. I have a partner named Santiago who is a criminal defense attorney and who processes stress through cooking elaborate meals on weekends, which means our kitchen smells extraordinary on Saturday mornings. We have been together for 6 years. We have a dog named Basura, which is what the emergency vet called him when we brought him in after finding him in the parking lot of our building, because he had been eating out of the dumpster for what appeared to be several days. He is large and enthusiastic and has the specific quality of a creature that has made peace with uncertainty and emerged from it loyal rather than frightened. He sleeps at the foot of our bed and considers this an inalienable right. Rosa lives 15 minutes from us and has dinner with us on the first Sunday of every month. Cello the cat is 14 years old and still runs the household with the authority of something that has never once doubted its own legitimacy. I call Rosa on Tuesday mornings, between my 8 o'clock and 9:30, and we talk about whatever is happening in a way that requires nothing from either of us except honesty. My father was released from federal custody 11 years ago. My mother completed her probation 12 years ago. I had not had contact with either of them since the week Patricio Boomselli came to our house with my folder of printed emails. That was the life I had built by the morning the certified letter arrived. The envelope contained a single document. It was a power of attorney form, drafted by a San Antonio law firm I did not recognize, designating my biological mother, Carmen Calderon, as my legal representative in all financial and legal matters, in the event that I was unable to manage those matters myself. The document used my birth name throughout. It was notarized and required only my signature. On the final page, there was a handwritten note attached. It was in my mother's handwriting, which I recognized, because some things stay in your body regardless of what you do with the rest. The note said that my father was not well, that the family was going through a difficult time, that she hoped I might find it in my heart to sign the document so that things could be settled properly, that she missed me and thought about me, that she hoped I had built a good life. I read the note 3 times. Then I set it down on my desk with the precision of someone handling something that requires care, not because it is fragile, but because it is potentially contaminated. I am an immigration attorney. I work with documents. I know what power of attorney forms are for, and what they enable, and what they do not say. What this form did not say was why Carmen Calderon needed power of attorney over a daughter she had not spoken to in 19 years. At a law firm in San Antonio that had no apparent connection to any family matter I was aware of. Addressed to a professional address that nobody from my former life should have possessed. I spent my lunch hour doing what I have been trained to do. I pulled the law firm's Texas bar records. I ran the firm's principals through the state bar's disciplinary database. I searched the firm's name in connection with the county probate and civil courts in San Antonio and Bexar County. I searched my father's name in the federal court system's PACER database, which contains records of all federal, civil, and criminal cases, and which I access routinely in my own practice. What I found in PACER took the warmth out of the room. My father, Eduardo Calderon, had been named in a new federal complaint filed 8 months earlier by the Office of Inspector General in conjunction with the Department of Justice's Office of Immigration Litigation. The complaint alleged that he had been operating as an unlicensed immigration consultant through a proxy entity, advising clients and directing their legal matters while nominally employed as an administrative coordinator for an acquaintance's logistics firm. His conviction and license revocation had not stopped him from practicing. He had simply moved the practice off his own name. The new complaint also referenced a set of financial assets that had been transferred from the original firm before his conviction. Assets that the government had not successfully seized in the original restitution proceedings because they had been moved into accounts associated with family members. The government was now seeking to characterize those transfers as fraudulent conveyances and claw them back as part of the new enforcement action. Family members, the power of attorney form would have established a legal relationship between me and my mother in financial and legal matters. With that document in place, my mother's attorneys could potentially have argued that certain assets and accounts nominally associated with me, accounts I had never opened and never controlled, were under my mother's authorized management and therefore subject to negotiation rather than seizure. My signature on that form would not have made me legally complicit in what my father had done, but it would have made the government's asset recovery significantly more complicated, which was, I understood with the cold clarity of an attorney reviewing a document, precisely the point. They had not found me to apologize. They had found me because they needed a tool. And the tool they had chosen was a document that looked like a family matter and functioned like an obstruction. I sat at my desk for a long time after I understood this. Long enough that my assistant knocked to remind me that my 2 o'clock had arrived. I asked her to reschedule it. Then I called Santiago, who is a criminal defense attorney and who has the specific value of being able to assess a legal strategy's dimensions without any emotional interference. He listened. He said 3 things. He said I should not sign anything. He said, I should contact the federal investigators directly rather than through intermediaries. He said I should also call Rosa. I called Rosa. She said 2 things. She said that some people only learn one way of doing things. She said whatever I chose to do, she would be in my parking lot in 37 minutes if I needed her. I called the federal case investigator the following morning. The call lasted 40 minutes. The investigator, a senior agent named Marcus Tran, was not surprised to hear from me. He told me carefully that they had been aware that my birth name appeared in certain documents associated with the new complaint, and that they had wondered whether I would surface. He said the letter I had received was consistent with an approach they had been tracking. He asked whether I would be willing to provide a formal statement and submit the letter and its accompanying note as evidence. I said yes. I said I could do more than that. I told him about 2 of my own clients who had come to me in the past 3 years with status problems traceable to the original firm's malpractice from more than a decade earlier, problems that had followed them through years of attempted resolution, clients whose cases had been listed in the firm's files as pending but had never been properly filed, clients who had not known, until they walked into Claridad, that the delays in their cases had a human cause rather than a systemic one. I had never had grounds before to formally connect those clients' situations to my father's specific misconduct. The statute of limitations on some of the original harm had complicated the legal picture, but the new complaint had reopened the federal enforcement action, which meant that information about the original pattern was newly relevant to an active investigation. I spent 2 weeks preparing the materials. I did it carefully and completely, the way you prepare anything that will be used in a formal proceeding. I organized the evidence chronologically. I drafted a detailed summary of my own history with the original firm, including the printed emails I had collected at 15, which had been preserved in sealed evidence storage since the original criminal case, and which Elena Vargas's organization could provide certified copies of. I included the new power of attorney letter, the handwritten note, and a documented record of how the letter had reached my professional address, tracing the process server my parents had apparently used on a Thursday morning. I submitted the complete package to the federal investigative team. Then I had my 10 o'clock client meeting, which was a family from Honduras whose case had been stalled in the Fifth Circuit for 2 years on procedural grounds. And I spent the hour working on their matter with the focused attention that the work deserves. That evening, Santiago made chicken mole from scratch, which takes 4 hours and which he considers a meditative practice. We ate at the kitchen table with basura lying across both our feet. I told Santiago what I had submitted. He said he was proud of me in the specific way he says it when he means it, which is quietly and only once. That was enough. The second federal case concluded 14 months later. My father was convicted on 6 counts of operating as an unlicensed immigration consultant, 4 counts of obstruction related to the asset transfer scheme, and 2 counts of suborning false declarations. His sentencing guidelines called for a range of 8 to 12 years. The judge sentenced him to 10, noting his prior conviction, the deliberateness of the reoffending, and the particular harm done to a population that had been specifically targeted because of their vulnerability to exactly this kind of exploitation. My mother, whose cooperation in the new investigation had been limited to providing information that protected her own assets, received a sentence of 18 months. I did not attend the sentencing. I submitted a victim impact statement on behalf of the clients from Claridad, whose names and circumstances were included with their written consent. My own statement was 3 paragraphs. The first described what my father's choices had cost me as a child. The second described what it had cost the 63 families from the original case and the additional victims in the new one. The third said that I was not there for revenge. I was there because the record should be accurate. The judge read my statement into the record before announcing the sentence. I know this because Marcus Tran called me afterward to tell me, which was not required of him and which I appreciated in a way. I told him clearly, I have not contacted my parents. I have not read their statements if they have made any. I have not responded to the letter or to the 2 subsequent attempts to reach me through other means that I was informed of through legal channels. I do not plan to respond. There is nothing to say that I have not already said, through the formal mechanisms of a system that, when it works, means precisely what it says. There are people who ask me sometimes whether I feel any grief about not having parents I can call. People who expect the answer to be complicated. The answer is that I have Rosa, whom I will call on Tuesday morning between 8 and 9:30, and Santiago, who is making something that smells extraordinary in the kitchen right now, and Basura, who is currently sitting on my feet with the authority of something that knows where it belongs. I have clients who trusted me with the hardest things in their lives and whom I have not failed. I have a firm called Claridad that produces, every day, the specific thing I was denied for the first 15 years of my existence. What I have is enough. What I have is mine. No one I was born to gave it to me. Every part of it was built by choice, by other people's generosity, and by the hard, unglamorous work of becoming someone who could hold it. I want to say something directly to anyone who is watching this and recognizing something in it. There is a specific cruelty in being controlled by people who use your dependence on them as both the instrument and the justification of the control. It is circular in a way that makes it almost impossible to see from the inside. You depend on them because they have arranged things so that you must. And because you depend on them, you need them to be trustworthy. And because you need them to be trustworthy, you find ways to believe they are, long past the point where the evidence says otherwise. This is not weakness. It is the natural behavior of a person trying to survive inside a system they did not choose and cannot yet escape. The way out is usually one person who asks the right question, not the dramatic question, not the confrontational question, the small one, the practical one, the one that creates a crack in the wall just wide enough for you to see through. It was Mr. Adalik asking if I wanted to tell him anything about it. It was Elena Vargas saying, with the precision of someone who had examined many similar situations, that she could not understand from a professional standpoint why this had not been resolved years ago. It was Rosa saying, on the first night in her apartment, that she was going to make eggs, and that I could have them however I wanted.